One example of a modern-day witch hunt that holds very clear parallels with those of the past is a phenomenon known as the Satanic Panic. It was fueled by local rumours and superstitions, driven by hoax allegations of devil worship, and resulted in numerous convictions of innocent individuals. Yet this was no medieval witch hunt. These events occurred only in the 1980s and 1990s. So, what was the Satanic Panic? The term Satanic Panic was coined by sociologist Jeffrey S. Victor in the early 90s in his book of the same name. It referred to a then still ongoing phenomenon that had swept the US and later beyond in the second half of the 20th century. The Satanic Panic saw widespread rumours that secret satanic cults were hiding in plain sight across America. These cults would allegedly engage in crimes of satanic ritual abuse, or SRA, that involved harming and sacrificing children to the devil, as well as targeting teenagers and young people to try and indoctrinate them into Satanism. It resulted in a multitude of legal cases, with individuals targeted with allegations of satanic crime based largely on unreliable testimonies and lack of evidence. This is something that shows strong parallels with historical witch trials such as those of 17th century Salem. The allegations of the panic were later widely discredited and the accused declared innocent. However, it had already had a devastating impact on the lives of many individuals, not least for the innocent individuals who had been falsely incarcerated, some spending decades in prison for crimes that never occurred at all. The Satanic Panic built on a number of pre-existing societal fears and concerns. By the start of the 1980s, there were already long-standing underlying fears around the danger and influence of cults. These concerns escalated following a string of horrific events and tragedies that had made major headlines over the past decades. There were also widespread concerns regarding child abuse. In 1974, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, or CAPTA, was introduced with the goal of addressing dangers to children. The bill placed a high emphasis on stranger danger, however seemed to downplay cases of abuse occurring within the home. These decades had also seen a significant shift away from what had been considered the more traditional family structures and gender roles of the earlier decade. Notably, a lot more women were entering the workforce, which meant that more children were going to daycares and childcare services. This was often presented in the media as a somewhat controversial issue, the implication being that working mothers were abandoning their children to the care of strangers. This stigma and the surrounding guilt that it placed on mothers was then reinforced by repetitive media reporting on cases of child abduction and abuse. The span of the panic from the early 70s to 1990s also saw the start of popular paranormal investigation shows and entertainment. Shows like One Step Beyond, In Search of, and later Unsolved Mysteries all centered around the potential to prove and evidence paranormal cases. They often took a semi-factual approach to their reporting. While they were generally careful not to state that their speculations were truth, they still were presented as possible, plausible explanations based on facts and evidence, or rather on missing facts and evidence. More often, these carried themes of American suburbia being haunted or secretly populated by paranormal entities, supernatural threats, and mysterious cryptids. The idea of an imminent alien threat, hidden amongst us in the local community and threatening families and faith, were undoubtedly themes that were later integrated within the narratives of the Satanic Panic. So the cultural landscape of the Satanic Panic was one of pre-existing fears, and linked with these fears was also a cultural landscape of guilt. There were fears of cults, of malicious strangers targeting children, guilt placed on parents, particularly mothers relating to childcare, and steadily growing fundamentalist rhetoric promoting the dangers of satanic influence entering the mainstream milieu. This created a pretty foundational environment for a Satanism scare to then take hold. The notion of satanic ritual abuse was first brought to public attention in 1980 following the publication of the now widely discredited book Michelle Remembers. Co-authored by psychiatrist Lawrence Pazder and his patient Michelle Smith, Michelle Remembers documents how Pazder allegedly helped Michelle to recover her hidden memories of being a childhood victim of a devil-worshipping cult and her claims regarding her experiences of abuse. Many of these claims were extremely disturbing, bizarre, and surreal. They involved the literal summoning of Satan and ended with the intervention of Jesus, Mary, and the Archangel Michael. There was never any evidence whatsoever for the outlandish claims in the book, and it has since been widely discredited as a work of grotesque fiction. While Michelle Remembers had already been published, the trigger that set the Satanic Panic in full motion came in the form of the McMartin preschool trial. This case first hit headlines in 1983, where rumours surfaced that children were allegedly being abused by the staff at McMartin Preschool in California. These allegations claimed that a devil-worshipping cult was operating out of the preschool and was abusing the students of the school as part of their demonic rituals. It led to the arrest of Ray Buckey, an employee of the preschool, his 62-year-old mother, and 5 other daycare workers on hundreds of counts of child abuse. To this day, McMartin remains both the most expensive and longest-running set of criminal trials in American history, lasting for 7 years before full acquittal. By this point, however, Ray Buckey had already spent 5 years in prison for crimes that he was not only later declared innocent of, but that there was no evidence for having ever occurred at all. The McMartin trial and its surrounding media circus triggered the Satanic Panic to unfold. It cemented the notion that a new form of abuse had been uncovered that was widespread across America: satanic ritual abuse. It became widely believed not only that these secret satanic cults existed, but that they ritualistically abused and sacrificed children as part of their satanic rituals, as well as coerced young people into joining their ranks. Sociologist David G. Bromley notes how individuals making the initial allegations of satanic subversion were individuals who entrusted their children to daycare facilities about which they had significant reservations and apprehensions. While it may seem far-fetched that so many people could believe in such a peculiar narrative, it's important to remember again that this was a time of existing fear around cults, child safety, and abuse. The existence of SRA then seemed in some way to validate these existing fears and concerns. These allegations then gained a further sense of legitimacy through the various trusted authorities that promoted them. The media, legal system workers, medical and psychological professionals, social services, and religious channels. Researcher Sarah Hughes has provided a detailed analysis of the role of tabloid media during the Satanic Panic. She notes how tabloid programs had become a dominant feature of 80s television, often reporting sensationalized content under the guise of being news. She explains how these exaggerated reports were given an air of false legitimacy through the use of general anecdotal evidence, dramatic reenactments, and on-screen reporting. So even prior to the announcement of Ray Buckey's arrest, news and sensationalized content were already heavily intertwined. Satanic abuse reports then became a popular feature of these programs, gaining them widespread popularity amongst US audiences. Sensational, even fictional content was often reframed within the lens of a seemingly credible news story. Repetitive reporting, even without sufficient evidence, therefore helped to exaggerate and indeed fabricate the apparent threat of satanic ritual abuse. This occurred alongside the simultaneous rise of televangelism, with fundamentalist TV and radio shows becoming integrated alongside typical forms of media and often discussed within them. At the same time, 1980s saw CNN begin broadcasting 24-hour news, which was often broken up with speculative stories to ensure that it would keep running. A variety of media sources were therefore available to push themes of satanic threat, which were then reinforced through repetitive reporting of SRA allegations around the clock. Media reports would also utilize supposed experts such as police, social workers, and psychiatrists, who were all being treated as the primary source of information about Satanism. This played a huge role in giving a sense of legitimacy to the satanic cult allegations. A common misconception around the Satanic Panic is that it exclusively or even primarily targeted actual occult practitioners. Still, its rhetoric certainly perpetuated harmful stigmas around the occult. The Church of Satan in particular was often broadly named as being associated with these SRA cults, as its formation in the 1960s had been considered highly controversial. Yet the image of Satanism projected through these false allegations is an entirely fictional one. It gains its fear from the fact that these cults are considered to be elusive and hidden. They therefore do not refer to a reality. The images and descriptions of the satanic cults of the Panic drew together sensationalized occult stereotypes, horror film aesthetics, elements of witchcraft, elements of Satanism, the paranormal, and ceremonial occultism to create a confused, amalgamated image of ultimate evil. These satanic cults were then largely defined simply by being subversive to all that was considered to be morally good. They allegedly worshipped the Christian image of evil, Satan, and engaged in the most evil crime imaginable, the abuse of children. This is what the scapegoating of the Satanic Panic actually comes down to. Not literal occult practice, but a broad sense of moral subversion, one that specifically threatens children as they ultimately represent the future of society. The idea of childcare workers secretly being involved in practicing SRA was a particularly horrifying conceptualization. The notion that those who are meant to care for children were actually harming them. Beyond just McMartin then, several other cases of the Panic focused exclusively on targeting daycare centres and childcare services. An example is the Oak Hill SRA trial of 1991, which saw Dan and Fran Keller, proprietors of a daycare, accused of SRA. The two were convicted and spent 21 years in prison before the misconduct of the prosecution was revealed and they were declared innocent. The rhetoric of the Panic also took on other forms. There were widespread claims that popular teenage music, particularly heavy metal music, and popular teenage games such as Dungeons and Dragons were secret tools of the devil that could be used to lure and coerce young people into joining satanic cults through hidden occult imagery and messaging. This again emphasized fears surrounding the subversion of the youth. Alternative-seeming teenagers in particular were often singled out as being at risk or having already been corrupted by Satanism. A famous Satanic Panic case that reflects this was the case of the West Memphis 3, which occurred nearer the later end of the Panic in the 1990s. It saw 3 teenagers, Damien Echols, Jesse Miskelly Jr., and Jason Baldwin, arrested and charged with the murder of 3 boys in West Memphis, Arkansas. Miskelly and Baldwin were given life in prison, while Echols, who the prosecution claimed led the attack as part of a satanic ritual, was sentenced to death. There was never any evidence nor physical motive that tied the teenage boys to the crime. The prosecution instead drew on Echols' supposed reputation as a loner who dressed in black, listened to heavy metal music, and drew pentagrams on his notebooks. The convicted 3 spent 18 years in prison, Echols on death row. In 2007, new DNA testing became available, which proved that the crime scene DNA did not match that of the West Memphis 3 and instead detected the DNA of a different individual. This led to their eventual release. This case reflects eerie parallels with the character testimonies that were used to convict witches during the Salem witch trials. Those targeted during the Salem trials were often considered community outcasts or otherwise as subversive to societal norms in some way. This is not the only parallel that the Satanic Panic has with the Salem witch trials. The McMartin case, like Salem, relied primarily on unreliable testimonies from children. In McMartin, the initial allegations came from the mother of one of the children at the school, who had also made similar allegations against her husband. Through extensive and very leading questioning, some of the children at the school then later affirmed these allegations against Bucky and the other employees. The interviews of the children were found to have used highly leading speculative questions, the transcripts often reading as outright coercive, with some of the children repeatedly resisting the interviewers' attempts to elicit testimonial statements from them. They also included bizarre, inconsistent, and in some cases impossible claims, such as the fact that Bucky alongside nameless witches would apparently be seen flying. The McMartin court was accused of withholding and outright lying about evidence by several high-profile parties involved in the case, with one prosecutor even leaving in protest. Despite this, the Satanic Panic continued to wage on for at least another decade after McMartin, and several of the individuals wrongfully convicted were not given justice until well into the 2010s. The Satanic Panic has since become known as a legal scandal, an example of widespread court bias and injustice, as well as a sociological moral panic and witch hunt. It might seem strange to think that so many people were taken in by these claims and allegations. But witch hunts draw on and appeal to very common concerns, use popular rhetoric, and are often disseminated by trusted authorities in such a way that can make them seem plausible even to the biggest skeptics amongst us. It's also important when looking at events such as the Satanic Panic to recognise that not all individuals involved in pushing these narratives necessarily entirely believed in them. Sometimes when we are afraid, it can seem safer to suspend our disbelief and take precaution just in case. For many, as Victor notes, the claims of the panic became a sort of half-belief in this sense, one that can be built into panic rapidly and then forgotten later on. However, it is extremely significant, particularly today, that we do not forget the events of the Satanic Panic. Recently, similar conspiracy theories and allegations have started to reappear. It's important to educate ourselves and others and to be aware of these past witch hunts in order to ensure that these histories do not keep repeating themselves.